I am a 30-year veteran of management consulting and technology. Also an independent researcher. It's taken me down a lot of rabbit holes according to Bedrock. When I was working with Bedrock, so we get down a lot of rabbit holes. So, but with that, I think, our presentation this evening, and if anybody who wants my book, Ed will generate an invoice, and any proceeds from the book go to IoT. So I'd encourage you to take advantage of that.
Thank you, Ron.
My pleasure. So with that, getting into the biggest challenge we face is that this is an era of transition, right? And just like any other era of mode of production changes, there's a gap in leadership. And part of that, especially nowadays, seems to be just based on a lot of activity that is not really based in strategy. It's based in fear of missing out. It's based in the idea of looking good to shareholders that we're doing something rather than actually aligning it to true value production. So with that, I introduced this idea of AI leadership and finding true north and closing that leadership gap. So before we get started, though, I'd like to learn a little bit more before we do the 30-second intros at the end of all this. Who here are software engineers? Okay. Who here are product owners and managers? How many executive class folks do we have that end up doing budgets and directing, right? Okay. So it's about a standard distribution, right, of the folks making decisions, the folks that are, doing the product backlogs and the features, and then, of course, hitting the keyboard to make it all happen. So, but with that, that helps me a bit. So this is really around beginning to introduce the idea that we've got to close these gaps. I've got a little bio slide here. So just, my recent projects, I was at Toyota for a couple of years helping us lead analyst the contact center modernization they first came to Texas. And that involved quite a bit. I ended up being pretty popular there and had a great relationship still with Toyota. I authored that book in collaboration with Toyota, and they endorsed it. So really I had learned quite a bit from my time there. Other projects, San Francisco, I was at DXC Technology at that time and was product owner of the Offender 360 series. So that was soup to nuts on justice, public domain, which included pretrial, post-trial, probation, and of course jail systems. And then IEEE work. I was on the IEEE committee writing governance rules for artificial intelligence with John Havens, executive director. John's still there. And that was really around this idea of well-being, right? And the biggest takeaway from that is that it's very difficult to actually have a unit test for morality, right? So I helped John get that landed into a better zone with respect to what you can achieve through an IEEE approach and standards, right? How do you make a standard for morality? And then my current position, I'm currently Chief Technology Officer at TBS. That's a McKinney institution. Got about 4 locations, $50 million business, not huge, where I'm directing some technology around MSOs, mobility service organizations. And this really, in just even conversations yesterday, is about intelligent workflows in automotive. That's the foundation of that. So with that, the main thing and where I started this conversation with Ed was I see a lot of people being knocked off their game by all the hype, and they're not sure which direction to be pointed in. And be able to rationalize it in a way that not only makes sense of it, but can help them make dollars. And so this evening, what we're going to focus on is the foundations of making sense in order to align it to making dollars. And my hope is that you won't be knocked off your game. You'll know what you're headed for. And that will be your filter. And as it's described today, I'm an old musician, so we always had our guitar heroes we'd steal chops from. And I like this particular chop here that's done by the University of Austin, which is Dare to Think. I thought that just really spoke to the era we're in. So tonight, again, Agentic AI, the new division of labor, what is the bedrock? What are the anchors? What is true north, and how do we establish that? Because this intelligence is not going to go away as something that we're trying to synthesize and inject into business, right? And I go into that in my book. We'll talk about this a little bit more tonight. So, going to go through the market backdrop, going to talk about the leadership gap, going to establish questions as destiny and maps as guides. We got to ask some good questions. We got to have some good maps. Then finding bedrock, anchors, and North Stars. If you're going to withstand this onslaught of information, right, you're going to need to know where things belong, how to plug them in. Coming to Agentic AI building and labor and engineering, I present in my book a rationality for co-intelligence and co-generation, and how to have a taxonomy for dividing it at the workflow level. We'll get into that tonight. And then, of course, we're going to have a little bit of questions and discussions. In this presentation, this is not formal. I am not a professor. I am a business and technology consultant that has been doing independent research. So with that, if you have questions, and Gary's going to help us keep that to not necessarily delaying the presentations too much, but I invite the discussion. So with that, hype cycle titles. For those who have been on the planet as long as I have, we've in tech seen many, many titles about the next big thing, whether it's mobile first, cloud first, digital first, content first, blockchain first, data first, influences first, and now this idea about AI. And the reality is that none of that really is a correct paradigm. It's always been people first, if you study the successful companies. With that, you just raise your hand if you feel this emotion when you're looking at the choices you got to make, right? Right. So with that, some people are saying, well, I thought AI was really supposed to be my friend. Even the Air Force is promoting it as your buddy. But I'm trying to discourage this idea of human trust imposed on a robot. So what is it we do believe? The industry hype, the AI demagoguery we see out there, people saying it's the worst thing ever, that's not real, or this is real. How do we just settle that, right? And get away from the political discourse and get into truly producing value that's human-centric, but not as a charity model, but as a model of recognizing what is it that humans contribute? Why cannot AI do that piece, right? And so I've got some frameworks that I've written around that to show you the things that have not functionally been mapped and probably never will be mapped into silicon, right? Or to algorithms, right? So with that, AI is doing the work, right? This is the latest on LinkedIn. I think as of last week, 7,000 jobs at Microsoft out of 64,000 in tech. And that they thought, okay, it's really AI. And then we've got a company that raised $500 billion, couldn't get AI to do anything, and went belly up. This is a VC slide. And then just recently, here it is, Klarna, who had a contact center, said, you 700 people can go home. We'll see you later. And then $40 billion later, and a couple of years to say, would you mind coming on back and helping us out again? So the bottom line is, how do we begin to handle this type of hype? So my encouragement is analyze instead of panic. The real meaning, the truth is in nuance, not in headlines, right? And so we need to use structured decomposition for nuance. We're engineers roughly in this room, whether we're engineering strategy or whether we're engineering the way we approach decomposition to workflows, or if we're actually trying to figure out our agentic structure. We're engineering. So with that, I want to give you the reference architecture. I want to ground you in things that are begin to help you with this decomposition, right? The Bureau of Labor Statistics recruited Gallup in 2018 to do a study on the impact of technology. And they employed MIT, of course, Boston University. And what they ended up figuring out is that technology does boost productivity, right? Ron's emails got a lot better when ChatGPT or Copilot started going, we might rephrase that, right? And so there were some productivity boosts, but it has a second effect. Okay? And the second effect is economic, but still positive in a GDP way, is it tends to suppress wages. Over the term, if you have AI doing more of the work, then you need less expertise. And that's generally the double whammy. So with that, you got to know how to use the tools. But the next effect, and you'll see this even in your own organizations, is reinstatement, which is, Ron's getting really nice summaries to his meetings. He's getting nice emails and other things that might tell him which meetings to attend or not. And he needs an internal team that's dedicated to the automations and intelligence, right, that generate that. So now we're standing up AI engineers. We got data pipeline engineers. We've got all kinds of reinstatement, right? And this is your second pillar to analyze. So you get the nuance that, 7,000 jobs might have gone away, but guess what? And I'll get into this, but there's a 10% higher density now in AI engineering, and there's another 15% in AI ethicists, right? And so what this is a restructuring. It's not completely destruction, but there is destruction, and it's called displacement. And the displacement is really around the idea of how do we begin to think about whole jobs being replaced or versus the analytic frame that they put it in, which I'll speak to here in a moment, of displacement. So we do know that there are some autonomous trucking and AVs beginning, right? I won't get into all the unit economics of that, but the real threat is where this analysis landed, which is it did an analysis at the task level. And that task level, it looked at the ratio of capital to labor and capital buying AI automation, robotics, right? And of course, just workflows. And so as we see more of that capital versus labor, we get this issue now of analysis called labor density. And labor density at the task level. And this is a natural effect of technology replacing tasks we might ordinarily do, such as summarizing our own meetings, right? It also has a bifurcation moment in it. If you ever studied the Power Curve Society Aspen Institute 2013 paper, it said, you know what? We've got engineers and we got investors, and these people are now in the Power Curve Society. Why? Because the net effect is they are able to scale out their effects through code. And it ultimately concentrates that into the people who can afford the $400,000 house instead of the $100,000 because they're being paid higher wages. So there is this bifurcation of wealth and income at this displacement level because those returns on automation and AI go to shareholders, not to employees. So it's a little bit of a double whammy, but I want to ground you. I'm not here to talk politics. I'm here to ground you in the engineering of it and the net effects of it, just so you're aware, right? And you'll see that in your own organizations as you keep it. So at this moment, I'm happy if there's any questions. Otherwise, I'll head to the next slide. I don't want to just monologue. Anybody have any comments on these three effects? Go ahead.
If it's coming later, no problem. But will you be commenting on legislation about AI and or removal of legislation from the state level, which happens to be in the news in the last 48 hours?
Yeah. So I'm, of course, aware, plugged into that. Let's do that as a conversation. We may end up doing it offline. The RAII, which is out of Austin, by the way, Responsible AI Institute, has proposed frontier legislation that even criminalizes running frontier loads without authorization. Yes, sir, I got it. It's going to have a effect that Microsoft and Amazon and Google love, which is not, and getting into standards. When AT&T and Southwestern Bell, they're called, but the greatest thing that ever happened to telephony, indeed, was standards. Right? And so at certain times in the market, standards really do help the market. The idea of democratizing governance, is another concept. We'll get into that later, maybe. but that's what I observed. And we can go into whether that's a good idea or not based on what we understand about the evolution in selective pressures. Does that help answer that? Good. Okay. So one of the things, in productivity, when we start looking at the nuance of this, McKinsey published that they think it's 2.6 to 4.4 trillion GDP productivity gain. Manufacturing, industrial automation has already seen 5.1%, generative AI knowledge workers, 66%. So again, the nuance tells the story. 13 billion in open AI investment is a signal of reinstatement. High skill AI roles increased the density by 10%. AI ethicist Microsoft grew 20%. So these are reinstatement effects. And then the thing I want you to see here is the correlations to productivity and reinstatement. When I'm gaining productivity, and it's through somebody coding and helping me with a task, we know there's a reinstatement effect. But we also know there's a displacement effect, meaning more of the work is being done through coding than the human, right? And so this is going to be a progressive thing. And of course, ultimately, it's where humans shine is going to be in the type of task that is not deterministic. Coming to, where McKinsey thinks this is at, and I don't necessarily think McKinsey's the Bible on this, but Citigroup, PwC, Boston Consulting. I tend to keep up with all that. Where they see it mostly is the low and middle skill roles, right? And so where you see the repetitive task and data entry, 30 to 40% impact there, and data-driven decisions, which are deterministic, rule-based, 15 to 25%. So this is the nuance, right? It's not Armageddon. There's just this shift to where value is being produced and the technology's contribution to that. Does that help with the idea of how we manage the headline? Which is what? Analysis, decomposition, and fact. Where does this belong, right? So with that, you're not alone. If you feel like, AI is creating a problem in your thinking and feeling overwhelmed. In fact, Korn Ferry in 2024 said 71% of our C-suites have imposters. 50% of their staff have imposters. And the real reason is they're not necessarily, in my opinion, grounded in understanding how to manage the direction of their organization with the technology. Right? So we're going to settle that tonight, I hope. And so there's this other thing. I happen to be associated with Purdue University on the strategic doing group. There's a rather remarkable guy there, Jack. One of those things that I think he's really reinforced is that if you understand organizational dynamics, right, which is this thing of appreciative inquiry. And what this means is we tend to appreciate or gain steam or gain value in the direction we ask questions. And so if we want to gain more value in better direction, questions become everything, right? And then, of course, along with those questions, if you don't have a map, if you're in Disney World and somebody says, or you say to somebody, how do I get to Space Mountain? Right? And they might, if you don't have a map, they're going to go here, go there. But if you have a map, they can say, oh, you're here. And here's how you find that direction. So it's a combination of asking the right questions and having maps that helps us navigate. And we're going to develop that a little bit more. But the only thing worse than the wrong answer is the right answer to the wrong question. What if nobody ever asked, what if we could click on this as an interface? Would the mouse have ever been developed, right? So questions do establish direction and sometimes destiny. And so better questions, better outcomes, informed from reference objects called maps. This is what we'll keep around this week. Coming to enterprise organizational process and digital maps, you guys have seen these, the org chart, that's a map. A workflow showing where things are done, functions are accomplished, and who does them. And then, of course, we get into the digital architecture. I happen to be an Azure engineer. Hey, where do we park functions in engineering? We're running mesh, we're running medallion, how are we doing semantic resolutions, all of those things, the digital maps. So the real question is, what is your map for generating value? And that's a central concept, which is generating value, not activity, but value that advances your competitiveness. And how do we measure competitiveness today? Really, we think about it actually, and it's comparative. We use industry benchmarks, we use regional benchmarks, we use internal benchmarks to determine, for example, if our forecast accuracy is only 65% and we're aiming for 80, right? And our initiatives then might focus on raising the bar to 80 because we know the downline effects. So where should we start this journey of value that will reliably inform our direction, right? And I say that we need to get to bedrock. And what does that bedrock look like? What do I consider bedrock? It's learning you don't have to repeat. It is a grounding design principle that is immutable and ultimately meta principle. You can apply it across many domains. That's bedrock. And that's been my endeavor. I don't know why I've got this little OCD loop running in my brain, but as an engineer, I decompose into schematics and trying to connect things. Anybody here who's a network engineer or desktop engineer, even the OSI model, when it comes to the data stack and your troubleshooting, is it a physical layer problem, media access, is it a logical link, right? These things are very helpful when you're trying to figure out where the exact problem is, right? Most of the time it's the driver, the NIC, right? Anybody's ever troubleshot that. But so that's what I mean by bedrock. But I want to expand that, because today the bar is being raised. The bar is being raised to the different disciplines you need to bring together to be effective. Okay, and so it is from the economic to the social to the existential. The economic is what value and activities do humans add? Why? Because that tends to promote whatever's going on socially. What we call the social dominance hierarchy, the heroes and the demons, right? And then the existential, which is, okay, well, if humans aren't doing anything in the enterprise, are they just going to go out and start paying or going sailing? Their relevance today in this mode of production is really around where they belong in making stuff for people, serving. And so I cover all three, but I mostly focus on enterprise in the economic and the social. And that's ultimately where we get to. So there's nothing more fundamental in value production than trying to figure out what is the purpose of organizations. So there's been a lot of ink written on this, certainly a lot of speeches given. I look at it as an engineer. I look at it as a functional level question. And so when we think about that, I don't know, has anybody else ever tried to figure out the purpose of organizations? Yeah, right? Okay. I think you'll appreciate my rabbit hole answer, okay, which is it's solving scarcity. That's an economic concept through creation and delivery of unique or preferred value. The unique value is something you can't find anyplace else, right? I found this over here and nobody else has got it. I'll pay $10 instead of $5. If I was going to get it for $5, okay, it's unique, right? The preferred value is it's 2 gates closer to get this hot dog here than walk over here, and my seats are over here at the game, right? So it's preferred that I just go back to this hot dog vendor versus that hot dog vendor, right? So sometimes preferred value is just a matter of cutting down the number of steps I got to take to get what I want, right? So there's all kinds of ways to think about that. But ultimately, it's to solve a scarcity. And who do we solve scarcity for? A sustaining people group? What is that also called? A customer. Right? If you don't have a sustaining people group, or if you're not actually fixing a problem, is there a purpose for your organization? Not one that's going to keep the doors open, probably not, right? Now, this comes to the technician in me, which is, okay, I understand, but how do I connect those things and identify their needs? How do I make sure that when they need me, I know they need me? The connections, signals, and feedback, right? How do I design loops from Facebook that says, look at that comment, right? Or from LinkedIn or wherever I'm gathering my signals from, right? Because what I'm actually trying to produce is this thing called insights, right? And insight actually, if you have it, confers in this moment this idea of an advantage that you understand something that maybe somebody else doesn't. Anybody see that movie called Moneyball? Right? What did he understand? Right? he knew that there was, this idea of getting a big league guy that could fill the seats versus actually put people on the bags and then drive them home, right? Run production, right? As you said, is really where you want to be if you want the bigger numbers on school board. So he was able to have the insight to know how that worked. So ultimately, insight, by the way, is one of the most durable qualities in any system you run as permanent advantage. And to the degree that you can generate those insights, you're going to be ahead of whoever else you're competing with. And ultimately, again, the NBA, next best action, right? What is the next thing I should do if I want to be able to create something of more value for my customer, right? If you study, and we're going to get into brands here in a minute, if you study the thing that defines most organizations over the long haul that survive is their ability to know what's needed today and anticipate what's needed tomorrow. Think about Steve Jobs and the way that he was able to know that people wanted portable music, portable computers, right? That's, portable internet. If you study his ethos, it's about making all those things that were formerly at a desk work, right? So with that, the purpose of organizations is a grounding principle that you should understand that that's how it's defined. And knowing the sustaining people group is very important. So now moving this to a business case. J.W. Marriott. Okay. So who are the sustaining people groups? Serve the accomplished. Like you said, their brand materials. And I was lucky enough to work with the Lexus brand team quite some times. But I, broke down the JW as well. So what is it that was the scarcity of preferred value? Luxury accommodations. And what's the ultimate luxury? Anybody who's a mom or a dad in here probably has felt a little bit under the gun from time to time. And on vacation, what are you looking for? The three experiences that these types of institutions provide, right? Which is decompression for the men, pampering for the ladies, and adventure and independence for the kids, called kids camp, right? What are those all share in common? Right? To have repose. So when we think about this idea of the purpose of the organization, these guys, eloquent brand statement, they know exactly what they're curating. And of course, their brand architecture, which I won't get into all of it here, is about how we think, the mindset. What are the core things that we do? Quality. If anybody's been to the JW or other Marriott properties, by the way, in hospitality, right? Uncalculated goodwill, right? And that anticipates just sewing into the relationship. And then the things they do extremely well, the differentiators that you should find in all business, which is they are authentic, which means they're approachable and still human. They certainly have an intuitive grasp. You don't have to figure out how to get from your room to the bar without too much trouble. Elevated and curated, right? The ability to create a place that you know where you're at in Taiwan, and it's such a unique experience. It's immersive, right? This is the bedrock of understanding what it is you're curating to serve the people based on their scarcity. If you leave this bedrock, you're going in the wrong direction. We do have ways to produce value that aren't customer focused necessarily, and we shouldn't ignore those. I need to automate my value chain, my procurement, and certainly make things more efficient. But if the customer suffers because of that, my investment's in a wrong direction because a vendor's telling me to go a direction, then I'm going the wrong direction. I'm being knocked off my game. So what is it that, if you've been to JW, one of the things that is the technological signal to action network is they quickly do away with disruptions. If you're heading to the pool and you're waiting on, a room service delivery, you've been waiting for a while, they intercept that, they'll own it, and they'll get it delivered right to the side. If there's an air conditioning problem in your room, whatever, Mr. Giblin, we got it, right? And so the way that they maintain and curate that place to think and be is to have digital capabilities on that iPad that can command the whole infrastructure to make sure you can go back to thinking and being, right? Everything from projecting what might be available in the spa for your wife as an appointment, right? Or tea time. They've got it digitally enabled to help support that curation. So with that, I'll stop for a moment and just any questions about that and this idea of affirmation. Is this resonating with the foundations of your thinking? Go ahead.
I've got a number of questions.
Sure.
First of all, thank you for coming with us. I love your optimism, I really do, but I guess I'm concerned. The increase in productivity is undeniable, right? So that's going to lead to, much like the computer led to, productivity expectations. Yeah. I mean, I think you rightly state that the almost the supreme desire is the decompression and the free time, which is the very thing that I foresee personally being like rapidly eliminated. So I wonder like how we juxtapose those competing demands. That's like side A of my question. Side B is like, do you think, just I guess hypothesize, do you think that the ever-present appeal of convenience provided by AIs will outpace the like almost intrinsic human need for security, or how will that be managed?
So the classic issue, and I'm going to go off book here for a minute. I've written 30 frameworks in consumer behavioral psychology, neuroscience, right? And the classic issue of horizon management and human behavior formation, survival, success, significance, transcendence, you know. And so the idea is, as we're in that survival horizon, we tend to be more opportunistic and we're looking for convenience because we're up against it. We're thinking 10 minutes ahead instead of 10 weeks ahead. And so this idea of the dependency and the convenience that you speak to tends to be framed in, you know, that survival mentality, right? If you study human behavior and underneath it, what compels it, striving and contention. This is in our DNA to assure that our species continues. You know? The striving you shouldn't remove because that's what keeps us alive. The contention, you do a better job of balancing that. But coming to what will be destroyed by vice or virtue, the vice of wanting convenience versus the virtue of, if you study behavioral economy, if you study executive function, right? And which is, if I don't have impulse control, right, the ability to not go after the convenience, I end up actually not being able to reach my longer term goals, right? That's just, and so part of that psychology is that, you know, that is a vice, right? If I just surrender to impulse, if I surrender to the headline, if I don't step back, it shuts down the behavioral catalog of available options, right? So to your ask, if you study the economies that of scale, they tend to be based more on convenience and vice. In that regard, there's a lot of vice economy, right, versus leisure economy. And so my prediction is that, ultimately that convenience is going to prevail. You're not going to sidestep that. But the right battle is to affirm human value and if you study, I did with IEEE, working with Renee Bruin. Renee is his PhD out of Columbia. We worked together on risk and brand in neuroscience, right, for IEEE. And at that time, the big people on Madison Avenue were doing neuromarketing. Yeah, right. And so the challenge was they were appealing to things that were designed to excite. Even I remember, because I was helping Lexus and Toyota being sent to look out at Lexus. I was ready for another car. And those guys very well understand that what they wanted to drive in me was anxiousness and compel. Yeah. Okay. It was a type of neuromarketing. And you're not going to do away with that. We're wired, if you will, for this acquisitive type avarice, right? Avarice being the big college word for greed. And so with that, yes, we're still going to be fighting that battle. The idea that, will coding ultimately redeem humanity's bad behavior? A lot of people think at a policy level, they can somehow just alter the code in humanity all of a sudden. Does away with striving and contention. I don't think you can engineer that. But I am optimistic. Let me say why I'm optimistic. I met some young people last month here that were doing drones and so forth, and even my own daughter. What I've seen is they definitely want to earn it. They have a different attitude towards a society today that is not convenience driven. Right, my daughter just got engaged, came back from Florida with her engagement ring. It was all above board. So he asked and we agreed. What I am encouraged by is that they're willing to envision a life together, and now they're both working double shifts to save the money to be debt free when they get a home. So my point being is that I am optimistic about Gen Z, and that I do believe they have a much better attitude and understanding, where they understand that I've got a framework around this, that subsidy, privilege are really distorting the economic calculus for performance. You don't want to be subsidized. You don't want to have privilege or entitlement. These distort the necessary actions and disciplines to achieve, right? And so that's what I see in Gen Z. So I am optimistic that we have a generation. Now, my job and my hope is to help, hyperscale thinking instead of just hyperscale compute and storage, right? And networking. And that's our challenge. That's why I wrote this book, Raising Your Game. The future is going to belong to those willing to build it and ultimately understand what it is to be human-centric, and not only human-centric, but drive it towards value versus charity. We cannot subsist our society on charity. It doesn't pay the bills. Even when Harvard invited me to the Global Action Platform on the Prosperity Track, and Scott Massey runs that, Christian Kettles is over at TCI, Harvard's Competitiveness Institute. We disagreed with if universal basic income is going to pay the bill. And the reason is because the natural effect of commoditization is it decreases margin. And it's margin that ends up being the available money to tax and transfer to pay UBI, right? So with that, at the macro level, having sat in, with Gary actually last week and visiting with Citigroup and the guys that run their data center, those guys tend to be very, replacement oriented, to be fair. I was not encouraged by that. But I do believe it's because they don't have a good vision for how humans contribute. But back to the dog leg convenience, yes, it's always going to be there. If you understand the neuroscience and why it's so is our mind is actually managing an energy budget. Yeah. And the energy budget is less energy for the same output. And that's what's being the economic calculus, right? And to the degree that convenience delivers on that, that's what's happening in the neurochemical circuits, right? So with that, is that an adequate answer? I don't want to.
I don't want to take all the time. I would like to talk to you after that.
Okay, no problem. All right. Well, with that, go ahead.
I'm going to ask the gentleman why he asked that question.
Very interesting. And it's kind of forward thinking. I would like to know, I'd like to hypothesize about what the future will hold with the advent of AI and with the various things that you talked about. You mentioned the neuroscience. That's actually kind of sort of my background a little bit, and at least in education, and neuroenergetics is what I studied. Right. So that's that's sort of the way I would see it going as well, except I take a less optimistic view of what you said. I tend to find that virtue is that's a needle in a haystack of millennials, much less Gen Z. But then again, I admit that I haven't been around the most, let's say, erudition inspired Gen Z. So I can't speak for the generation as a whole. But that is your
I do have some frameworks I know that will interest you on this, and I do cover those a little bit later in the presentation. But with that, we'll park in like that one, and then you'll see the agentic frameworks, and then I think it'll help provide some of the context.
Rashida, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just realized there's more to the presentation, so I'll keep that for later.
Okay, all right. So stimulating so far? Thank you. So with this, we also have to consider the journey of the organization. I have a larger framework on the future of work. and it talks about the ideation ecosystem with two parts: R&D, where we develop, research and ideas, and then the enterprise cycle, where we take them to market. But this is the enterprise cycle here, and enterprises typically go through 3 stages. If indeed there's history to record that isn't on epitaph. So they go through being sales-led, where they're proving the value, what they build is worth it. They tend to pursue the logo deals. Hey, I've got Marriott as a customer, and all of that drives the steady state for the next level, right? Which is next round of funding typically. Then we move into, once we get that and we got our value prop done, then it's about scaling the market. We open up new geographies, right? We hire regional salespeople, and certainly expand to new geos and cohorts. And then finally, that's channel hunting. And then we move into sales and channel farming, which is we build out our geos, we build out our cohorts, our segments, our markets mature, and now it's really just about harvesting what we built as a brand, right? And we move to a farm. And so that's the journey of enterprise. So you have to be able to understand what this journey is about to properly know where you're at in this journey to form a proper strategy. So what I focus on here is, of course, those 3 stages, but that any product, it starts unique and it has a premium, needs a sales force to explain it, right? Why is Blu-ray better than the DVD? Or why should I get this 8K TV instead of the 4K? Somebody's got to tell me why that's better. It's a complex sale for a minute. But eventually, after it's been successful, it moves from being novel and unique to being normal and commodity, right? That's the journey of products and services and an evolved organization. It moves from being a startup to ultimately being a big brand. So that's the journey of organizations. We have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about AI. And so our bedrock thinking here should be informed by, who and what has been successful. And what this comes to is the social construction of enterprise, which is we exist based on brand promise, right? And think about your own relationships and the promises that are in those relationships that make them stable and predictable. Yeah. So brand contract, and then of course, brand experience. And what this means for an IT guy at a CTO level, which is how do I start scoping my work to focus on those things which will amplify the social tapestry and promises of brand, right? This is the right framework and bedrock. And so let's do an example here. I guess my build didn't work right here, but let's talk about FedEx. Okay, what's their brand promise? We deliver the world on time. What's the brand contract? When it absolutely, positively has to be there. Okay, and what is the brand experience? Customer confidence at the center of all we do. There was a moment in engineering at the retail level when FedEx had locations of people coming in, dropping off their packages. And people were just kind of like, man, that's a very high leaning tower pizza. I don't feel comfortable leaving another box here with you because, it doesn't look like you got this under control. And so FedEx went, okay, tell you what, we're going to put a wall between the drop-off counter and the boxes back there. We're going to put slots for, FedEx Priority and FedEx Standard, right? FedEx Ground. And then you just drop it, and whatever goes behind that wall, the customer goes up. They don't see the big stack behind it, right? So it was a psychological thing as well, right? And so, and then the purple promise, which is I will make every FedEx experience outstanding. So it's a cultural thing. It's this idea of, indeed, we do see great corporations executing on promise, contract, and experience. Why is that important? Because when you want to make a superior investment, you're going to engineer an experience. Where's that experience live? What's the inhabitation of it? We'll get to it, but it's called a workflow. We do a workflow for, hire to retire or lead to opportunity, right? There's steps in there, right? If we make the lead to opportunity process nice for the salesperson as well as the customer, right? We are engineering an experience, are we not? So with that should begin to anchor the idea how you're going to peel this onion, right? And so the thing about that we're missing today is, paradigm, patterns, and practices. how should we think about this? What is the idea of value? I was talking to a friend of mine, my employer, CTO, John, 2 days ago or so. I said, John, the key element is having a philosophy towards work. What is that? We know if we allow people to have focus time, they tend to be more productive. Is that a philosophy? Okay. Well, let's talk about enablement now, which is I'm going to suppress the poster on my email. I'm going to have AI look at the number of meetings that I go to every week that are just reporting meetings. I'm going to cull that meeting schedule by 30%, right? So ultimately, it comes from this idea of philosophy. And then there's principles about that. We're going to talk about those a little more deeply. That ultimately lead to paradigm, which is the way we think about work and how we set it up structurally to right? This is paradigm. And so what supports that? Frameworks, workflows, and methodology, which we're going to cover. And then, by the way, my specialty, human-centric reference architecture. What is it that can't be mapped into silicon or algorithms? How does it contribute to value and why? Where does that position us from a co-generative and co-intelligence, right? In other words, what's the human position in all of this? And why is it not cherry? Why is it actually value generative? So coming to the philosophy, okay, chapter 6 in the book, grow intelligence, grow capabilities, grow performance. Is that pretty angle? Why grow intelligence? Well, intelligence is the linchpin to unlocking all forms of capital. Would you agree if you're more intelligent about your time, about your resources, right? Is that not the linchpin to any strategy is growing intelligence? How we think about the moment, how we employ and set patterns of activity, right? And growing capabilities. So what if, not just this idea of making Ron smarter through AI and recommended things, but what if I had a capability in an organization, if you know target operating models, innocent concept, and you add a position called analytics sales administrator. Well, that's a $200,000 a year job, right? But what if we can code it? It's a deterministic workflow, right? I do my win-loss analysis. I actually can see my true cost of sales, right? I can actually look at velocity in pipeline. I can look at fit of product. We're going to break that down later. Having said that, the principle of growing capabilities is that if I can plug that in code where somebody doesn't have an administrative sales guy that's doing analytics, say a mid-sized company that doesn't have the 200,000, I can do it for 30. Now I've just given them the ability to actually decrease their cost of sales, increase the quality of their pipeline, right?
Maybe you wasted $30,000 on a vendor. You just collapsed your business.
But I bet that growing capabilities that actually delivers a recommended sales team is not a bad investment. If you've got 3 teams that are in a pursuit, the ERP team, the CRM team, right, the field service team, and then of course the infrastructure team, Google, Microsoft, or Amazon, that's a pretty expensive pursuit team.
Yeah, the problem is these vendors these days, they don't have skin in the game, right? Or back when I used to sell NCR and IBM, we had skin in the game. That if it doesn't perform, we'll take it back, you get a discount, whatever.
Yes, sir.
That doesn't happen today.
I'm not disagreeing. And so hence the need to get away from vendor recommendations and play your own game. Okay. So
It's capital.
So with that, let's get into other concepts because those are use cases, right? Breaking Dunbar, my neuroscience friend, economic moments, that's a behavioral economy idea. Precision, velocity, and curation, which is I want more precision in capital allocation. I want more velocity in capital movement, and I want defect-free curation. You can go in any boardroom and argue that. They can't figure it out. Okay? Now, they're going to be more binary, like as in, okay, what's going to be our market cap and dividend return, and where's the revenue coming from? What's our margins? Of course. But they'll never be able to beat that argument as far as the essence and anchors of analysis. And then finally, human-centric, augmented, and relational intelligence. So these are philosophies. So this framework, again, chapter 6, begins to lay out the way we frame out and think about our use cases. How do we break Dunbar? Is there moments where huge queries would be better performed by AI rather than humans, complex queries, right? What about the idea of the limitation of human scale knowledge, which is we only know about this room at this moment, unless you're looking at your phone and looking at the weather outside, right? That's our experiential bubble, right? We all live in it. So there's things beyond the walls that AI might be able to contribute to. And so when we start looking at the other things in organizational dynamics in an agile workforce, innate intelligence and adaptive intelligence, the things we know today about an account, which is I know the team, I know the mobilizer in there, I know who's got check signing authority. That's the innate. The adaptive is, I just saw his title change on LinkedIn to another company, right? So maybe I lost a sponsor. So we need those elements to begin to dissect them and get them into signal and data flows. And then looking at those bedrock pieces of economic moments within a workflow. What do those tend to revolve around? Decisions. Why? Because they set patterns of resources, right? To resolve whatever you're deciding. And then the economic principles of getting efficient allocation, capital velocity, and flawless curation. You're not going to get anybody arguing with you about that. What they will argue with you about is, we're over budget and we're over time, and we don't have scalable code. It's breaking. Yeah, they're going to argue about those things as they should. But ultimately, this comes to this idea of forming a philosophy that what creates the forward motion of enterprise? Task execution. Why? It is the economic ore in the water. More tasks executed, more value created most of the time. Right? And so to the degree that I'd be better at my task execution, I actually get more velocity and more bang for the buck for each time I row that ore. So when we start thinking about this idea of bedrock and paradigm, it has to come with thinking and rationalization as to why you believe that. And it provides a lens for analysis. That's what it's for. Right? So when you start doing criteria for how should I think about this workflow? How should I think about this task? Right? Because the engineering task is analysis, decomposition, factoring, or refactoring. That is the engineering task. Right? So with that, moving to modeling and methodology, I propose, and this comes in fact from MIT and BCG, and I've added some things to it, which is how should we think about the division of labor in intelligence production, right? And how is it going to be best? What you'll notice about these modes, okay, in dividing intelligence, there's only one mode here, the first one on AI-centric, which is deterministic, which is standalone. The rest of them involve human collaboration and decision, right? Go ahead.
Oh, you keep saying deterministic, but most people are looking at it.
Absolutely. So the issue is that you don't need an LLM, in my opinion, to run deterministic, right? Deterministic is, can I get 99% of my use cases in rules to get the outcomes for that task that I want? That's what makes it deterministic. There's other qualities to that. There's other deterministic qualities, things within a workflow that I would propose. For example, if Dave went out and he just landed a client and he's going to propose a $5 million proposal, what I really want to know is what's their DMP score, because 70% of stuff we do, we finance, right? I need to know whether they got the bang for the buck. So that's deterministic though, right? So there are deterministic characteristics in some of the steps that aren't very clear based in the math or empirical, but just a sequence of activities, right? So does that help with your question?
I mean, it does, but I'll let you know keep going.
All right, so we decide later, but ultimately what I'm trying to point out here is that the most successful use cases tend to be co-intelligence, code generation. And why is that? Because humans add social intelligence to the empirical. Right? We know what the elasticities are in policy. We have a different way to collect signals. I'll get into my cognitive architecture in a minute. Our signals are based in how we're different than AI. Okay, so in the world we manage, there's three pillars in our existence that we tend to manage as phenomenological agents, right? Which is the physical, biological, and social. AI only occupies one of those pillars, right? The physical. It's in silicon. It has algorithms, et cetera. It can observe the biological, It can observe the social, but it is not an experiential entity. And it doesn't have the tethers to culture
Or to check.
or to enemies or to advocacy, which are the shared human ethos of navigation of life. It is not tribal, right? Humans are tribal. Why? It's a survival mechanism. We join groups because it's a better chance to survive in a group than it is by yourself. Right? So those are the ontological differences, but this is the way to taxonomically dividing intelligence. Yeah, I think you're going to like the next few slides. Chain of thought reasoning, and that AI's reasoning is more empirical. Human reasoning has a lot of elements that go into it that are quite different. Even meaning making, sense making, meaning making, there's a difference there. But getting down to frameworks, how do we peel this onion? Where should we pick as a point of attack in order to transform the organization? I say it's one workflow at a time. Now, you can have a bunch of workflows you're working on. Work streams, in fact. This one's out of healthcare, it's out of my book. And with that, I also reveal where to look for these workflows. What are the candidates that should be reviewed for AI automation or agentic AI? What are you thinking about in modernization of your technology? So with that, there's a lot of people probably are familiar with some tools out there, Confluence, Jira, right? If you've been doing any work at all, certainly ADO, Azure DevOps, right? And within that, we have structures of ethics, right? Themes, sometimes goals, and features. And then underneath features, we have user stories. Right? And so you don't have to look any further than ADO or Jira or Confluence, right? To get an idea of different steps and activities that are being performed, right? So with that, what it ultimately yields is, a map and process that begins to help you navigate the places you should target. And of course, that should be a bottom-up thing where you're working with the people that do work, because they can tell you what's heavy lifting, what isn't. And now here, coming to the piece as far as cognitive architecture, this is human cognitive structure. And ultimately, what it represents is functional areas of how chain of thought is developed, right? And the human ability to collect signals, right? The signals we collect are based in the energy domain, right? The photonic, the auditory or acoustic signals, right? There's even EMF our bodies can detect. But it's all based in energy. And there's collection mechanisms within the human body that provide those signals, right? PNS, CNS, enteric nervous system. Right? And at different speeds. PNS is more oriented towards threat detection, right? But with that, the reason I bring up this is your functional model to think about how we model AI. Because what we're doing with AI is replacing human function. Think about 2012 and the NVIDIA day where we started doing CNN, right? Which was being able to recognize images, right? And where does that go here? Well, there is a visual pattern detection that humans do. And we recognize it and we semantically label it. Right. Auditory signals, we have tactical signals, things we touch, proprioceptive movement, how we get the XYZ coordinate system back here, figure out how far my hand's out there. Of course, emotional and imaginary. But all these feed our percepts and drive information into our perceptual space, right? But the things that are missing, which is now being addressed in, let's say, level 3 agentic AI, is memory, right? So remember how now we can actually have contextual conversational memory in Bedrock. It remembers what you told it or applaud it, where that wasn't there before. And protocol memory, which is actually tends to be out of culture, but there is this function of memory, right? Protocol memory is what are the things we're supposed to do based on culture, right? Unified knowledge of the world. Well, as experiential beings, what is it? You study affective neuroscience that humans do in order to understand the world. We forage and we collect boundaries and objects and content that has cause and effect relationships, mapping in a single word. And so it's this mapping process that creates this unified model that helps us figure out, oh, that's a cup, right? And that's still a cup, even though it's glass, right? So those are things that AI hasn't quite gotten to. The attentional system conductor, if you're doing agentic, you know about this piece in tokenization and certainly, being able to get MCP going. But this is the human cognitive architecture. That is the foundation for, connecting the visual to vision, connecting the auditory language, certainly the tactical or robotics automation. If you study robotics, you got to make sure your robot doesn't swing someplace you're standing. And of course, the active inference modeling and the machine learning, which is now coming because of memory. And then moving to the chain of thought, right? Which is the whole enchilada on how we do, back to the dog leg, reasoning. There's other aspects to reasoning that are not represented in this model, okay? So we're going to cover those, the agentic cycle. Think of it, for those who are Toyota, study, whatever, OODA, observe, orient, decide, act, right? And with that, can we model values? Is there a gap in agentic AI to model values? Probably. Hang on, let me go back one. Didn't mean to bring that. Belief, right? Where do beliefs flow from? Well, I'll show you in a minute, but culture. And then, hang on. Intention. Well, we know in chatbot, we have to detect NER, the named entity resolution, right? So what is the intention? Book a room. What's the entity? But it's called accommodation of room, right? So, intention has to be established. Then the true lever of value creation called choice, which then creates behaviors, both mental and motor plans go into motion, right? And then we observe through OODA concepts results, right? And then that feeds back into how we did with that, right? But within that, this ties to, which I didn't cover completely, the imagined states and the percepts in the cognitive model architecture, right? Because in the cognitive model architecture, I'm running scenarios on the most likely and easiest way to pick up a cup of water, right? I run simulations. If I drop it, right, what's going to happen? So this is the imagined state, which is the metaphysical state, which is things that are in my mind before I create. And then, of course, we move into a kinetic state, right, which is I put things in motion and reconstruct. Of course, that leads to the influence now of culture. Well, what is culture? And by the way, these didn't exist out there. That's why I created them. I couldn't figure out why someone had done that before. But anyway, so culture is patterns of socially contexted behavior within the ideas of morals, ethics, customs, and systems to meet needs. Right? So within that, there's another piece of this in my Foundations of Collaborative Production framework around rituals, routines, right? And icons or symbols. So is Cinco de Mayo a ritual? Is there an icon that represents that? Yeah, right. And so my point being, these are the unmapped things in the agentic architecture. This is space AI can't really occupy. This is social intelligence born from culture. Right? And coming back to our conversation with our Citigroup guy, he thought you can actually put rules in enough to model culture. And I don't think so. That's kind of complex. With that, where does that play out in our cognitive architecture? Remember, I talked about the mental imagined states, the prototypes in which we create solutions before we implement them. But here's where culture plays in to the model in our unified model of knowledge, right? We accommodate culture. It's called social intelligence. And then what about the cycles of choice? Well, here it is, chain of thought, right? That moves into the coordination and orchestration. So all I'm getting to here is there are AI patterns in design that are modeled after human function, and there's some gaps. And that's good news. That AI, because it's not ontologically the same as humans, that's our competitive mode as humans, provided we know how to amplify it and properly monetize it through a business. So with that, here's the whole model showing that culture and it feeds into the agentic cycle, and the cognitive architecture is the computer that figures out the most likely way to benefit. Here's another model that talks about an element that is unmapped called judgment, right? And these are attributes in judgment of accountability, courage, transcendence, drive, collaboration, right? Humanity, humility. Is there any such concept you think in AI for humility? I think you can have it mimic. At best, AI can mimic. It doesn't know that humility is born out of an idea of willing to be wrong in some ways, and then the harm that it can do in relationships if you are too narcissistic about it. All I'm getting to is there's qualities that cannot be done by rules and won't be done by rules. With that, we can debate that later, but ultimately, what does that mean in designing and coding the future, right? So this is a process I've put together around the methodology of engineering AI. And what it does is it begins to walk through the workflow and look at the actor and the environment. It looks at the high-level mapping for the economic moments, which establish patterns of resolution. It looks at workflow steps in inquiry based on the economic principles of precision, of velocity, and curation. It looks at what are the supportive pieces of intelligence we imagine that would improve the productivity. And I'll get into the business case here in a minute, meaning real business cases. And the workflow step, et cetera. All I'm getting to is there is a methodology by which you can decompose this and begin to augment the workflow at the task level with intelligence and make it co-generative, co-intelligence. And for those who are still having a challenge there, my encouragement is, what if you don't? Where does this go? If you don't take your game to this level, where does this go? And the answer we found at the largest level was really that it's really oriented towards replacement. So that's my challenge, and that's why I'm here. Coding collaboration or misguided replacement? I'd rather code collaboration. I'd rather make sure that indeed it's economic in its character, because humans are indeed the social intelligence that AI cannot really have. And in a way, provide the other things in the human experience. What does the human experience need? A continuum of care that acknowledges human value, called hospitality. That gives us what we need. Harvard did a study about the pastoral experience. What is it? Pastoral experience is this idea of a type of economy where if it's small enough, you could walk in a room, they say, "Hey, Ron, welcome in." Right? And then if you had something to say, the room would allow you to speak, to have a voice. And then the third thing, most importantly, is that if something went down, you felt like somebody had your back. Right? So when we talk about the idea of the human continuum, I don't think anybody thinks that AI is going to jump in the foxhole when your bullets fall. You might be able to do a few things there, but it's not in that foxhole with you. And it doesn't have an expiration date driven by whether the body has integrity or not. Right? Maybe. We'll see. There's,
Wars going on today,
so
every day.
But so paradigm evolution. All I'm saying is we've seen paradigms evolve since the digital age. We moved from the attention economy, which was driven by the yellow pages before it was driven by a web page where you do a search, find a business to help you out. We moved to the engagement economy where we could get marketing and sales materials downloaded for the interest we had in products. Then we moved to the experience economy where we unified the online and the brick and mortar experience, so your loyalty card works in both places. And then now where we move it here is relational production, right? And if you study how Agentic is set up, it indeed, and even machine learning, it's about exposing patterns of relationships, cause and effect, that are predictive in certain behaviors. So how do we find true north? How are we doing on time?
We're getting close. 7:30, we need to call it quits. So you got 9 minutes.
Right.
So do you want to ask some questions?
Yeah. So true north. So the true north is really about unifying everything I just told you around the philosophy, the principles of engineering to produce paradigm, the frameworks I just exposed that then are grounded in a transformational unit called workflow. And then, of course, you got to apply methodology to that, to decompose and rightly divide the labor deterministically, probabilistically, based on code generation. And then the human-centric reference architecture I just gave you, which is these are the things that are not mapped and probably won't be mapped. And so when we start looking at a step within a workflow, we have to make accommodation for those kinds of things that are inherently social. And by the way, provide judgment contexted in locus. You know, you're from a culture, you're in a geography, you have a community, you have all these things that are your locus, right? Those things contribute value because you know, hey, I'm wearing the Dallas Cowboys jersey, Dallas, right? So with that, modernizing and integrating the next generation enterprise design thinking, which is what I'm here to do, is you guys got to raise your game. If we're going to prevail and keep this century human centric, you got to find the business case, the best actor assignment for the task, and go towards co-generative and co-intelligence. Now, I do have a quick workshop after this to break it down in order to decompose a workflow. But I think we probably ought to defer to more questions.
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah. So with that, stimulating thought, I mean, it's not going to be perfect in the idea that it will appeal to everybody, but
Yeah, well, I like your optimism, but I'm thinking of things like, well, you have a senior developer,
right.
and now he has help from AI to help with coding and all that. So maybe the company doesn't hire the so then there's not a path for the junior developer. And then suddenly you lose a generation, that Gen Z maybe. They may be motivated, but they don't have a path forward.
We saw the same effect when we started to offshore, right? Our career ladders moved over. And to your point, the ability to have a ladder to climb and so forth. I agree there is that in likelihood because of the effects of technology and coding. And so, you know, the real imagination should be how do we redistribute? And the classic issue, what is the value curve today? What is new in business to do that adds more value? And this is the right question, because we know over time, the arc of technology, right, is going to create new social patterns. Social patterns follow the arc of technological pattern, right? So my encouragement there is I don't think I can turn that off. Your concern is well-founded. I think, but just like JCPenney and Sears, if you remember, what they failed to do is grow the next generation of consumer. And that's why they ultimately failed. And while, you know, you had other shops that were providing less expensive clothes. So with that, it's a real concern. I think there are some answers there, but it has to be around the vision for growing the next generation coder, the next generation leader. That's the proper orientation. That's what I can encourage.
Tim?
Yes, sir. I also want to say I'm jealous of your optimism, and I'm trying to identify kind of the linchpin of the difference between our perception. You'd mentioned that what we, the buzzword AI now, is based upon mimicry when it interfaces with humans.
Yeah.
When you look at the scale, the trajectory of acceleration, we're seeing multiple logarithmic exponentials in different modes.
Sure.
Is your opinion that there will still be things that AI will not be able to mimic better than humans? Is that
the classic issue is whether, and this comes to the selective and evolutionary pressures of two species that are distinctly different. Yeah. Even now, AI is causing existential problems, right? AI needs the power for compute, and so you got to shut your air conditioner off at whatever time. And so the idea of the optimism, and this comes back to the future. The future hasn't been written yet. Owning our own future. I choose procreativity. I choose strategy and bedrock of value production. And I'm going to do my best to anchor that to preserve human position because I know what happens if I don't. And with that, that's about as good as it's going to get, meaning that there are those who have a binary world and that they're only interested in the binaries and because their life depends on that. But I think post-employment, post-human. How long that's going to take, if it actually occurs, there are some people who think that they want to provide it. The social or economic, social, existential, right? But I don't have great answers, only to say that I know my own answer.
For IoT, you have worked with Toyota. I'm not asking for specific information, but would it behoove people in the space to anticipate a paradigm shift in battery capabilities?
So, of course, physics, right? Some of that's good. Ultimately, the economy of the EVs, there's a number of society, right? Solar scales, but it doesn't provide the type of voltage regulation that flywheels on generators provide, because those actually dynamically respond to load by spinning faster or slower, right? That we were going to end up with a big challenge on right. But I don't predict it'll be as quick as all that. The hybrid technology is far superior because it operates with the physics of charging. Yep.
So I understand this from the perspective of like adoption of is much more organized because they already have like a product and they're expanding onto it. What's in design the workflow and everything. Now I also see a lot of startups coming up with a lot of Gen AI ideas. Some of them, when you just see them, okay, this is something you need. But some of them look like, okay, something very simplistic, like just a chatbot or a automated AI calling system or something like that. And you might feel but sometimes simple things make big changes.
Sure.
So are there any small tips for people who are outside the organization to understand the potential of that organization?
So the classic issue in gaining space in a market model, the introduction of iTunes. Why was it successful? I had occasion to talk to Steve, but the real intermediated, right? It delivered value upon a click, and the unit of consumption, right, and supply now were what the booking agency. I can upload my music, right? So that disintermediated the mod. And by the way, that industry went from acceleration of delivery of value. You click it, you got it, right? No record store, no cruising the aisleways, right? So now retail is affected. And then we move in unit of supply and demand now being, all right, so now I'm down to 99 cents in revenue instead of 15. How long do you get one song? Really? $7 billion out of it. So when we talk about disruption, okay, you talk about the Gen AI, are they disintermediating a model? There's lots of ways. Matching the equilibrium of supply and demand at a unit level the consumer prefers, right? Or is it more like Blockbuster? which is I don't really want to pay. What are the compelling drivers that make it distinctive enough to be investable? How is it disruptive?
Safer, smarter, faster, cheaper.
Price, quality, and niche. Those are your three dimensions. And so if you serve a select group, or if you have higher quality, or to Dave's, is that these types of questions are pretty answerable. Of why you made the bet.
Gonna be around for a little bit?
Yeah, I'm here.
Fantastic.